and to discuss with you the topic of ICTs for e-environment, and with special attention to developing countries. So I see a few faces from that area, a very small percentage actually, which makes me very sad. But I hope there are many people out there listening to us now over the internet. So I would also like to introduce you to the role of the telecommunication development sector of the ITU. And one of the main reasons I'm here is because I will present you this one, which is the draft version. We haven't printed and published it yet, but you will find it online. And what it is, it's the report on ICTs for e-environment, which has been recently prepared by Mr. Richard Lavelle, whom, as you know, is present with us in the room today, and with inputs from Mr. Ralph Rutschert and Mr. Tony Fetter, and from the division I'm representing here, happily, the ICT Applications and Cybersecurity division of the telecommunication development sector. So the previous speaker, Don, had a question on what is ITU's role. You will see that later. Click. So the agenda today will begin by introducing the objective of the report, the methodology we used, and on how using ICTs to tackle climate change, the implication, as I said, for developing countries, and the conclusions of the report, following up with recommendations, and the proposed approaches and tools, in the end, role of the ITUD. So last year we thought ITU should do, and the development sector should do something on environment and on climate change. As you know, the ITU has organized in 2003 and 2005 the World Summit on the Information Society. And one of the action lines, C7 on ICT application, has one aspect which deals with ICT applications. There are several fund groups who are so kind to implement some. It's e-agriculture, e-learning, e-commerce, e-health, e-governments, etc. There are 8 of them, and among others there's e-environment. And the business plan of action mentions how to use ICT applications to use natural resources. The second item would be how to produce, how to use and consume, and in the end dispose ICT components. And the third part is on disaster and early warning telecommunications. So, having our main clients, the developing countries, in mind, we said we would like to give them the opportunity to provide some guidelines and see what actually is happening out there. Because, as also one previous speaker mentioned, we sitting here in this room and listening to over the webcast, we have been interested in this topic, we have been considering this topic, but there are many people out there, they, although already knowledgeable a little bit about it because of the... Oh, there's a problem with the microphone. What do I do then? Can you, everybody can hear me? Should I speak louder?
You got the okay.
Okay, thanks. So, so we have targeted the decision maker in developing countries, the donor agency, the international development community in general, private industry, research and development institution, and civil society. So the study involved extensive data collection via the internet, literature review, and interviews, followed by analysis ranking the e-environment applications that I just have mentioned, based on the ease of adoption by developing countries, and the environmental scope, technology, transferability, and the impact. The methodology of the study also involved an analysis of the organizational domain, identifying the linkages amongst the agencies and administrations for specific e-environment programs. And finally, it determined a series of categories of ICT applications, which you can now appreciate on the following slide. So you can see the 6 areas that are interconnected via the arrows and sitting on top the capacity building. Richard and his team was assessing over 150 ICT environmental applications. And the list is in a table in the annex and here, and I can just recommend to you to have a look on it because it's just fascinating to see what is all out there and that we probably don't know. We have a brief description in there, like where is it used, why is it used, what's the good thing about it, who is the sponsor or the owner of this whole project, which region do we have, like do we have Africa, do we have Europe, is it a global thing, when was it actually initiated, and the most important thing right now maybe for you to go further into detail is the web reference. So I do not want to bother you too much about these things, the 6 things on the bottom on observation, mitigation, adoption, the management and protection, planning and analysis, because you heard this for the last 2 days. Overall saying we need the capacity building, we need the behavioral change of each individual, everybody sitting here, me, you, to do something about it and to do it now. So this framework now leads us to a better understanding of the key ways in which ICTs can effectively be used to tackle climate change. The first of these involves using ICTs for monitoring what I just mentioned and to gain a better understanding of climate change. Without ICTs, that is, without sensors and without the satellite-based observations covering the globe, linked data analysis, points out around the world, it would be impossible for us to detect the extent and the nature of climate change taking place today, as you all know. And without the facts, action, that would be impossible. So the second issue concerns improving the energy efficiency and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, GHG, of the ICTs themselves. We have seen that beforehand. We have the direct impact, we have indirect impacts, and we have the systemic impact. Improved technologies and utilization practices for ICTs can hopefully allow us to bring down this level of emissions of the 2 to 3% that we heard as well, and to reduce this substantially. So one of the main contributions now of ICTs and ICT applications, however, will undoubtedly be in improving energy and material efficiency and reducing GHG emissions in other areas of human activity. So for instance, we can achieve this by enhancing the production efficiency in agriculture. Why? Because, we have the food insecurity issue right now. So we can use ICT applications to move on this issue forward. We can use telemedicine, which is part of e-health applications, between rural areas and main capitals where there's a bigger density of doctors to exchange medical data information, to store, to send. Imagine a nurse in a village that doesn't have the general practitioner's profession, obviously, needs to know something, takes a picture, sends it electronically, and then to the doctor, and the doctor comes back. Otherwise, the doctor would need to travel back and forth. He can't do that. That is a real benefit right now, as you know, on ICTs. And this limited travel time will have an effect on reducing the emissions, as we know, on GHG. So other improvements would be in logistics and transportation, as we heard today, and the more efficient work practices, travel replacement practices, information dissemination, rather in electronic than in printed form, etc. We have all heard that today. So one thing that the region really highlighted was we need more research now. Although we have seen there's a lot of things done, there's still more to come and still more to do and more development of technologies. So we need to understand more clearly the ways in which the ICTs can be used and to help us to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change specifically for developing countries. Because these important changes will have to take into account business and the consumer behavior. And also, these things have to be supported by effective government policies and priorities. So the implications for this, for developing countries, are that all countries can respond to climate change by a process of adaptation to its impacts and by cutting those GHGs, and thereby reducing the rate and magnitude of climate change. The capacity in each country to adapt and to mitigate is then dependent on socioeconomic and environmental circumstances, in addition to the availability of ICTs. Now, some might, oh, but we don't have the necessary energy or the necessary infrastructure or the necessary PCs or... So yes, many countries actually, in developing countries, many regions, don't have just a limited capacity to make effective use of ICTs for environmental action because they don't have the access that is required for affordable ICT infrastructure, including the internet. There are also limited human capacities to collect, to analyze, to interpret climate change data, and to integrate scientific data into decision and policy making. Finally, developing countries very often have a limited capacity to undertake adaptation and mitigation, and supported by the necessary research and development. So the report concludes that ICTs act both as a villain and as a hero in our efforts to reduce GHG. They are emitters on the one hand, but they are also essential to controlling and reducing emissions, as we know. So the report also notes that it will be necessary to facilitate a systematic approach, both at the international and the national levels, to find those solutions necessary for these complex and cross-cutting issues. So timely and preventive actions we need this in order to become an essential element of national and international planning. Critical attention will also need to be given to increasing the energy efficiency of the ICT infrastructure in developing countries and to the manner of how we dispose those ICTs that we use. So ICTs will have to be very closely integrated into efforts to aid process efficiency and to develop the information flows and networking needed to tackling climate change. In short, it is essential that developing countries today gear up to take full advantage of the potential of ICTs for action relating to the environment and climate change. So recommendations that we received in this regard is, in the first place, it will be necessary to raise awareness on how ICTs can be used for dealing with environmental issues and climate change, particularly at decision-making levels in the public and private sectors. It will be also important to carry out continued research using life cycle assessment methodology, that we also have seen already, to determine the real costs and benefits of ICT use in terms of the environment. And especially concerted action will need to be taken to strengthen the capacities of developing countries to use ICTs for environmental action, especially regarding adaptation and mitigation. This will need to focus on issues such as strengthening national analysis, planning and implementation, fostering technology transfer, using existing and new financial mechanisms, promote best practices in the use of ICTs for this effort, and finally, develop and use public-private partnerships as key mechanisms for action in this area. So as you know, we had the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change the last 2 weeks in Bonn. And these are also some of the matters that were discussed on the high policy level debate. Concerning approaches and tools, we would like to start with the development of a national strategic planning framework or an e-environment action plan at the country level. So these plans will involve several stages, starting with an assessment of requirements and capabilities, followed by a consultation and awareness promotion, the development of a vision statement and board-based goals, and building a strategy based on clear policies and immediate and long-term objectives. So from this then, we will have specific action plan and we will have the performance indicators based on results-based management and poverty reduction strategy paper indicators, as well as mechanisms for monitoring and evaluation. So such comprehensive e-environment action plans may be difficult for some countries to carry out because of the limited resources we have listened to beforehand. But in such cases, there might be a much faster and rapid option, which is rapid e-environment assessment, covering the assessment phase only of a national action plan, and then a recommendation or recommendations and priorities for the action would follow with their corresponding costs and benefits. So the report proposes as well the development of an e-environment toolkit to specifically support the undertaking of these assessments, and the ITU will follow up in this regard. I would like to conclude this presentation by outlining the role, as I've promised before, of the ITU's telecommunication development sector in this process. So ITU's mandate in this regard on ICT applications and strategies involves functioning as a co-facilitator on Action 97 on e-environment of the World Summit on the Information Society. We help to develop guidelines, training materials and toolkits on technology and policy aspects of e-environment applications. And our aim is to assist developing countries in implementing those relevant ICT applications in order to support environmental and sustainable development. The challenges and opportunities that ITUD, which is the abbreviation of our sector, faces in this regard focus on awareness promotion, working with other international partners for capacity building and coordinated initiatives, and supporting developing countries as our clients and customers based on an approach that typically involves implementing pilot projects whose results are then monitored and evaluated and then expanded to other countries based on the lessons learned. So we are very much indebted to Mr. Richard Labelle and his colleagues for developing this report and providing us with a clear guideline to follow in this effort, where the highest possible priority needs to be given to tackling these issues relating to climate change. So here you can see some information where you actually find these bunch of papers, which is 200. That's why we didn't print it yet. And I would also like to conclude by indicating to you some sources of further information I've touched upon in this presentation if you go on climate change on the ITU website itself. So we will look forward to continuing our dialogue to deal with these critical issues, and Mr. Labelle and I are now happy to respond to any questions that you may have in this regard. Thank you very much.